Question number 10, the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Trade. Does he stand by his description during the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations of the Canadian dairy industry as belonging, quotes, in the former Soviet Union?
Honourable Tim Grosser. Order.
Yes, because, Mr Parker, it's called a negotiation. And to use one of Tana Umanga's memorable phrases, we ain't here to play tiddlywinks.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Honourable David Parker.
Has he seen international media reports that his abrasive and arrogant negotiating approach has spawned a new urban slang term in Washington, D.C. for, quotes, counterproductive, undiplomatic sledging, that term being grossing? And how does he think slagging off the Canadians using derogatory terms is going to result in a good outcome for those negotiations?
Mr.
Order.
Speaker.
Honourable Tim Grosser.
Well, unfortunately, I haven't seen those allegations, but I'm really interested to have a look at it. At least it might mean we're making a mark.
Point of order.
Order. Order. Order. Order. Is it a point of order from the Honourable?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table a document by a Delaware-based policy analyst, Mary Bates, dated Thursday the 14th of May.
Order! Order! Again, this is a point of order. It's the seeking to table a document, and I expect it to be heard in silence, particularly from my right-hand side. Honourable David Parker.
Saying such incendiary fighting words clearly do nothing to assist Canadian diplomats help New Zealand help themselves.
Order. The document's been described, I think it was dated, was it?
It's the 14th of May.
14th of May. Leave us sought to table that particular document. Is there any objection? No, but can you see? Order. Is there any objection? There is not. It will be tabled.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Honourable David Parker.
Will he accept responsibility and admit he has poisoned the negotiation if it transpires that the TPP terms do not reduce tariffs on dairy products to Canada to similar levels as were achieved in the Chinese FTA?
Honourable
Mr.
David,
Speaker,
Mr.
Speaker, I'm prepared to make an offer to the member that if this negotiation is successfully concluded, I'll introduce him to the adult world of New Zealand and Canada on dairy over the last 30 years, where they have pitched their interests diametrically opposed to New Zealand's interests, and it takes just a little bit of spine to stand up to it.
Supplementary.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Honourable David Parker.
Is the reason he doesn't think his insult of Canada has further damaged New Zealand's reputation in trade negotiations because he's already trashed it by using the GCSB to spy on the rivals for his WTO job?
Honourable Tim Grosser.
Mr. Speaker, as far as damaging the Canadian sensitivities, I have come across an article by a very senior Canadian political leader called Martha Ann Finlay, senior enough, I believe, to contest the leadership of the Liberal Party. It wouldn't mean much in the Labour Party context, which says, quote, why Canada's dairy industry supply management is so flawed. So this is a matter for debate within and outside of Canada, and it is in the middle of a negotiation.
Point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
I also seek leave, sir, to table the Reuters report of the insult, sir. It's dated Friday the 18th of April 2015.
Order. It's probably relatively freely available, but on the basis it'll be over to the House to decide, leave us sought to table that particular media report dated 18 April. Is there any objection? There is none. It can be.
Supplementary.
Point of order, the Honourable Jerry.
Mr. Speaker, just hearing a little bit from Mr. Parker about the content of these news items that he's now tabling, I think is particularly interesting. I'm wondering if he might be so good as to bundle them all up and circulate them to members that we might all enjoy them.
Order. The purpose of tabling the document is to make sure that they are then available to all members. It's over to members to get them from the table.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Honourable David Parker.
Given growing international opposition to investor-to-state enforcement provisions in countries like Australia, Europe, New Zealand and the USA, and the litigious nature of US companies, would his government agree to the TPP without ISDS clauses if this outcome was available?
Mr. Speaker,
Honourable Tim Grosser.
we would take a position very similar to the previous Labor government, which inserted these ISDS clauses into a number of the agreements that it successfully negotiated, including the China deal. The answer is there won't be a deal in TPP without ISDS. So we are negotiating with great care to ensure that there are adequate disciplines over that policy and adequate safeguards.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the right honourable.
In the interest of introducing Mr. Parker to the adult world, when will he take himself out of rumour talk about being the next ambassador to Washington, given his totally inappropriate use of the GCSP to spy on international associates of ours in the advancement of his own egotistical, narrow career?
Order.
Point of order.
Point of order. Jerry Brown.
Mr. Speaker, that might be a very entertaining question for Mr. Peters and his colleagues, but, sir, it is so wide of the mark to be unacceptable as a supplementary question.
Mr. Speaker,
Order.
Mr. Speaker, he did refer to, and he put it into question, the issue of being part of the adult world. And that's what I'm hanging my question on.
I think, order. The question is certainly the order. The first part of the question is certainly completely out of order. There's no ministerial responsibility. If the minister wanted to address the second part of the question, he can do so. And that was the bit about
Mr. Speaker, happy to address the second part of the question. We have a process for investigating all of these issues. We'll wait and see what the Inspector General has to say on the matter.
Order. Question.